This morning service, can we all rise to our feet? Let's just start this time together with a prayer. Father, we thank you for this morning, for this time that we have with you, God. You are the Creator. You are the Alpha and Omega. You are our Father. You are our Lord. You are our King. And that is why we are here, Father, to worship you. Open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to you, O God, today. That we, as your church, be united and committed and devoted in exalting and blessing your name. We love you, God. We cherish you. We adore you. And in Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Amen. Let's worship him, church. will rejoice, I will declare, God is my victory and He is here. Amen. He is our victory, our hope and King. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine, heir of salvation, purchased of born of His Spirit. Yeah, church, cry it out. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day perfect submission, perfect delight, visions of rapture that burst on my sight, angels still standing, bring from above. Here goes our mercy, whispers of love. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. You are worthy. You are worthy, Lord. Praising our Savior all the day long. This is our story. This is our song. Praising our Savior all the day long. Oh, we praise you. You are worthy. So worthy, God. More than we can give, God. So worthy. We fix our hearts on you, Jesus. Oh, yes, God. In the darkness we were waiting, without hope, without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes, to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from a throne of endless glory, to a cradle in the dirt. Come on, church. Praise the Father, praise You are worthy, God. Oh, worthy of our lives, God. You are worthy. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, our Savior, our Redeemer, and our friend. We fix our eyes on you, Jesus. And together, united in heart, we cry out, you are worthy, you are worthy, you are worthy. That is why we are here today. It's all about you, not about us or anything else. So you're united in heart. Again, we fix our gaze on you. Jesus, the champion, the author of our faith. And we cling to you as a branch clings to the vine. We cling to you. And from that place we ask an overflow of praise, an overflow of worship. That this time that we have committed to you, God, may be the pleasing sacrifice to you, our God and King. We love you, Lord, and we exalt you. May you be glorified forever and evermore. And in Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Amen. Let's give up a clap offering. Standing for the confession of the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived of the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. The third day he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of God, the Father Almighty, whence he shall come to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the holy universal church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. Amen. Church, you may be seated.
Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Great to see you guys out here on this rainy Sunday morning. Is there a typhoon? What is going on? It's not supposed to be this rainy at this time of the year in Korea. Anyway, it is what it is. Still, praise the Lord. We are grateful for him. I'm here to go ahead and share our church announcements, but before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and introduce anyone who's a newcomer here. Please know that we have a newcomers orientation immediately following the service. For anyone who's new, if you'd like to get to know us, we certainly would like to get to know you. The meeting is actually only about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, but it's a full and wonderful 15 to 20 minutes. And you also get an Ecclesia, the name of our cafe, Ecclesia drink coupon. So, hey, not to incentivize anything like this, but hey, there's an incentive, all right? And I think today, because it's Fellowship Sunday, which we'll talk about, I think there's going to be some food involved, but don't quote me on that. Anyhow, if you are new here, first time to Jubilee here today, never been here before, we love to welcome you. All you got to do is from where you're sitting, don't be shy, but just raise your hand high so we can welcome you. Is that okay? So yeah, there we go. Yay! Welcome everyone. Welcome, welcome. I see you guys. Welcome. Fantastic. Great to have you guys here with us. All right, fantastic. On to our announcements. The first one is about one of our partner organizations called ELM, English Leadership Ministry. They have a walkathon coming up. They serve North Korean young adults here in South Korea to support them with everything from college tuition to mentorship and to help them into life, help them integrate into life better and better to have that support system because they really don't. Anyhow, they're having a walkathon, a fundraiser. It's their third annual on November 1, 8:30 a.m. More info is coming soon, so mark your calendars, okay? You can also check their website too, look them up, Elm, and I'm sure that there's more information there. Another announcement about another partner organization called Oak Tree. This organization supports young adult orphans in Seoul. Okay, so they are those who have aged out of their homes, and they don't also have much support after they age out from the government. After 18, they're kind of on their own, and it gets a little bit wild and crazy for them in negative ways because of their lack of support. Oak Tree is there to support them through. It's very similar to Elm. They're having their fundraiser as well. Everything is about walking or running, a healthy way to support, okay? Not to mention the resources and the prayers that we can give them as well. This is a run or a walk, a 5K, 10K, or even a half marathon on behalf of the orphans of Korea. The event will be held on Sunday, November 16th at 9 a.m. at Tuksum Han River Park, Seoul. Registration is 50,000 won. By the way, this is not their own event. They're piggybacking onto another official, like 5K, 10K, half marathon. I think there might even be a marathon too. Registration is 50,000 won. All proceeds go to Oak Tree Project, a scholarship and mentoring program for orphans in Korea, right? Please register at the site there, and let's get involved this way. As mentioned a little bit earlier, today is Fellowship Sunday, every last Sunday of the month, besides the summertime and then during Christmas because everything's so busy. We have what's called Fellowship Sunday, a time to get together and eat together as a church. Not only good food, but especially with good company. So yes, today is Fellowship Sunday and the menu item is Hungarian goulash. I guess perfect for a rainy day like today. It's a hearty and flavorful stew made with tender beef and onions and paprika and carrots and potatoes served warm. Again, perfect for this day. The cost is 6,000 won. We're serving it both on the first floor and on the second floor. There's rooms all available upstairs for eating and hanging out. So please keep this in mind, especially since it's raining. Why go out and get all wet when you can stay inside and be warm and cozy with Hungarian goulash? Yummy. Okay, very good. We have these fellowship groups called hobby clubs where we, as brothers and sisters in Christ, share the things that we enjoy doing ourselves together as brothers and sisters in Christ, hobby club. So if you go on our app or on our website, you have a full list of them. We have 7, 8, 9 of them. I kind of lost track. I probably should know exactly how many. But anyhow, for this one, I just wanted to give you a quick, this is one of many, so you can check out the rest on our app. Yes, the Foodies Hobby Club. They're going to Star Samarkand on that day, Saturday, October 4th, and this is a Uzbek Russian cuisine place. I've actually had the privilege of going to Samarkand in Uzbekistan. It's an amazing place and the food is amazing. So please go ahead and plan to be there, but if you are planning to be there, you have to RSVP, okay? You have to RSVP. All this information is also on our app. I see a lot of people taking pictures of announcements. I appreciate your enthusiasm and your involvement, but you just need to download the app. And then there you go, it's all there. That and much more information. So download our app, Jubilee Soul. All right, good. Our Wednesday nights this month, in the month of October, will be led by Pastor Andrew York, and it's a study in the book of Daniel. The title is called Faithful Resistance. We start right here in the sanctuary. We are starting this Wednesday right here in the sanctuary at 8 p.m. We will skip next week, because next week is Chuseok. So we'll skip that week and we'll reconvene the week thereafter. But this month, we're going through, again, the book of Daniel under the theme of faithful resistance. We have a grief and loss workshop, as we've been announcing, available to you. Let me go ahead and read this for us. Are you grieving? Are you unsure? Grief can touch our lives in many ways, and that is true. Sometimes in ways we don't even recognize. So we invite you to join our grief and loss workshop, designed to help anyone seeking to understand how grief affects us and how we can begin to heal. Whether you're currently walking through a season of loss or simply want to be better equipped, this is important, better equipped to support others, because somewhere, somehow, someone is surely hurting, right? This workshop is for you. This workshop is a rare opportunity to explore loss without having to share personally about it. all right? It will teach tools for the journey through grief and understanding without judgment. Let's see, this workshop is on October 19th from 2 to 4 p.m. It's on a Sunday, so it's during the second service time. It's going to be upstairs. There is a fee of 10,000 won. This is all especially to reserve your spot as well. You have to sign up by October 15th, Wednesday. The sign-up forms are on our app, all right? And I would say maybe most importantly, it is hosted by Laura An. She is one of our house counselors. She is one of our Jubilee Counseling Ministries house counselors, but she's also a U.S. licensed therapist, and this is one of her specialties, concerning grief, the topic of grief. So if you're interested, do not tarry, get signed up. Sometimes there's pain, that's true, but sometimes there's joy, and that's true as well. And the next announcement is a joyful one. Because our Sri Lanka fundraiser is 100% fulfilled, yay, Jubilee! Woo! Well done. We raised, if it were $1 for one, back in the day, it was kind of close. Can you believe it? But it's nowhere close. But just for easy speaking, 53 million? What is this in Korean? I'm confused. 5,300만 won. What is that in English? If it was $1 for 153,000, let's just make it simple like that, right? We raised this much over the course of a month and a little bit. And again, thank you very much. They're leaving this Wednesday. So, woo! Praise the Lord. All right, with that said, I'd like to transition us into a time of scripture reading and prayer. And for that, I'd like to welcome Deacon Eugene Swen to the podium.
Good morning, church. Today's scripture reading is taken from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 1 through 14. Again, that's the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 1 to 14. I'll give you a second to find it in your Bible. And I'll be reading from the New International Version. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far side, the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, that nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into this world." This is the word of the Lord. Now let us bow our heads and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this church. Lord, we thank you for this family. Lord, we thank you for the privilege we have to gather and worship together on this Sunday morning. Lord, as a family, we give thanks for the blessings you've given us. At the same time, we also lift up those among us who are in need, who are suffering, who might be in a season of trials and tribulations, whether it be related to work, to family, to health, to finance, ministry, or anything else that we might be struggling with. Lord, we ask that you cover them, that you cover us with your mercy and grace, and fill us with your love and with your presence, just as we dedicate ourselves to care for one another and minister to one another in this community. Lord, as our mission team prepares to go to Sri Lanka next week, we are reminded that you also call us into the wider world to participate in your redemptive work of deliverance and transformation. We know that we're called to be your hands and feet on this earth. Lord, sometimes the work of ministry and mission can seem lofty, can seem difficult, can seem intimidating, and oftentimes we feel like we're not enough. We feel like we're not ready. Lord, but we know that all that you required of us is that we bring what we have and contribute what we're able to give with love and with faith. Lord, so in all that we do, Lord, today, tomorrow, every day, everywhere, Lord, help us not diminish ourselves and underestimate the gifts you've given us. Help us not succumb to doubt and fear or to the lies of the enemies, Lord, but help us instead, Lord, to do your work with strength, with humility, and do so in your truth, in your beauty, and in your justice, and in your peace. Lord, as we prepare to listen to today's sermon, Lord, we ask that you fill our speaker, Elder Bob Shim, with your anointing and with your presence. Lord, empower him to deliver your message and center all of us, Lord, in this church. Clear our minds and hearts, Lord God, so that we may hear exactly what you want us to hear. Thank you so much. We praise you, we worship you, we love you, and we give thanks for all that we have. And we pray for all these things in the name of your Son, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right, good to see you guys here together again. Here I am, but here to introduce kind of a guest speaker, but not, as you will hear in a second, as you already heard in the prayer. But before we start, can I ask you to take this opportunity to recognize why we are here? This is proper theology, that we are here for more than just he and me, but we're here for he and we because he's making a family of us. So can we turn to our brothers and sisters all around us and wish each other a good morning in Jesus' name? Can we do that, please? Good morning, Ecclesia. Yes, so again, I'm here to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Kind of a guest speaker, but not. Guest because I guess it's his first time sharing, but not because he's an elder of our church, newly minted, all right? He was commissioned just some weeks ago, but he is actually not here to share about who he is because every time we commission a new elder, they go ahead and share their life story and kind of a word of encouragement to the church as an introduction of themselves. That's actually coming later on in this year. But Elder Bob is here for another reason. And to go ahead and share that, let me go ahead and share a little bit of his bio, and maybe you'll understand why he's sharing today. First of all, he serves currently as a regional medical officer with the U.S. State Department and currently stationed at the U.S. Embassy here in Korea. But before the State Department, he spent nearly 2 decades as a missionary with Serve Globally, the mission agency of the Evangelical Covenant Church from 2001 to 2020. Served in Kyrgyzstan and Thailand, focusing on medical missions and holistic community development among village communities in Central Asia and refugee communities in Southeast Asia. Served as an Asia regional coordinator for 5 years, overseeing missions work and ministry partnerships across the region. So he has a sterling, sparkling resume before the Lord to serve him and his kingdom to all nations. And he is coming to share with this background because today we'll be commissioning our Sri Lanka missions team. They're leaving on this Wednesday, so it was more than appropriate that someone like Bob, who happens to be one of our elders, comes up. I like to read a fun fact that he actually mentioned is that he lived in 7 different countries as an immigrant, a missionary, and a diplomat. Along the way, he picked up 4 languages but can't speak any of them well, including English, he says. We'll find out soon enough. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Bob De Niro Shim.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Good to see you. I just want to take an extra time to extend an extra welcome on this rainy Sunday. Whether you've been attending Jubilee for years or just a couple of weeks, or maybe you thought you were going into the bowling alley and went into the wrong door, but please know that you're welcome here. Know that this is a safe space. It's truly a joy and a privilege for me to speak and share a little bit about my journey, a little bit from the Bible, through the lens of my journey. And now, despite Pastor Dave's generous introduction, chances are many of you don't know me. I've only been attending Jubilee for about 2 years now, so a more detailed introduction may be in order. So as he mentioned, I currently serve as a physician with the U.S. State Department and am stationed here at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. But in a previous life, my wife Grace and I were missionaries for almost 20 years in a small Central Asian country called Kyrgyzstan, and then later in Thailand. I worked in medical missions, and Grace, whom some of you may remember, she spoke here last fall. She focused in the area of mental health because she's a therapist. Mostly in my mental health, she focused on. Actually, there might be some vintage slides from like 20 years ago of our ministries, and you can just kind of roll through them. I want to take this opportunity. We have some special guests here. So when we were in Thailand, we were there for about 10 years. We worked with some special ministry partners. And just by pure coincidence, they happened to be visiting us because they're attending Empower Conference next week. So I want to briefly point them out to you. Is that okay? So Patrick, Tip, and Ang, can you just raise your hands and wave? All the way from Thailand. So please say hi to them. Say hi to them afterwards. Grace and I are also parents to 3 grown adult children scattered across the U.S. And over the years, we've also lived in places like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. But my journey actually starts here in Korea. I was born here to mostly non-Christian family. I think we weren't very religious. We followed some Buddhist traditions. And I was what you might call a late surprise. My mom had me when she was almost 40, long after my sister had been born. And when I was born, finally had a son, so she rushed me to a Buddhist monk that she knew to give me my name. And in case you're wondering, the Buddhist monk did not name me Bob, okay? He gave me my old school Korean name, which is Pom-yeon. So my name is Shim Pom-yeon. There you go. Now, as you can imagine, life in post-war Korea was pretty hard. So when I was 5 years old, my family kind of uprooted and we moved to South America. We moved to Brazil. And so starting at an early age, I was adjusting to new cultures, new languages, and trying to find my place. But it was also attending a Brazilian Korean immigrant church in Sao Paulo, Brazil, that I found Jesus, attending Sunday school, and I also found my calling. Now, my church in Brazil happened to be a very missions-minded church, so every year they would have something called the Missions Month. Sorry, I gotta take a drink. And they would invite missionaries that they supported from all throughout South America to speak at that church. I was about 8 years old at the time, and to be honest with you, I couldn't tell you where they were working or even what they said, but I remember as an 8-year-old kid sitting at the very front row, just being totally captivated by what they had to say. And that's when I heard in my heart, Bob, you're gonna be a missionary someday. It wasn't an audible voice, but might as well have been because throughout my childhood, high school, college, and later in my adult life, it really shaped everything that I did. Now, with Grace, I met Grace in college. I attended a church that her father pastored. And actually, it was a very spiritual meeting. It was actually at a mission prayer meeting. And we were assigned, our small group was assigned to pray for the country of Japan. And as we were kind of bowing down in prayer, our hands accidentally touched. And our eyes met, sparks flew. And I thought I heard a hallelujah chorus, I think audibly this time in my mind, and I knew she was the one. But there was a catch. She wanted nothing to do with mission. She grew up as a pastor's kid, and she had her fill of ministry, so she didn't want to do anything. So it took a long time, but I had to wear her down. No, actually, it was through God's mercy. Slowly, she began to say yes. She said yes first to a short-term missions trip to China. She said yes to me, and then eventually yes to a lifetime of service. Now, the great irony is that, I had this calling to be a missionary all my life, but now I'm in the secular field, and Grace is still a missionary. She leads Serve Globally, which is a mission arm of the denomination that sent us out as missionaries. And so God has a strange sense of humor in that. After completing my medical training in the Chicago area in the US, I had this calling, so more and more I was sensing it was time to go. I practiced medicine for a while. All of our school loans were paid back. We had some church commitments that were wrapping up, and I thought, this is it. I gotta put up or shut up. And finally, when the moment came, I was super anxious, and I froze, and I was really nervous. And when I boiled it down, there were two fears that were holding me back. Number one was my kids, and if you could put up a picture of them. So this is a vintage prayer card that you put on your refrigerator from circa 2002. This was a long time ago. They were so cute back then. I meant Grace and me, not the kids. Actually, Grace is still cute. I've really aged. But our kids were 8, 6, and 2, and I wrestled with guilt because, they didn't have any choice in this matter, right? I was forcing this life of missions on them. And I had visions of them growing up resenting us. And I was just kind of picturing them sitting in a therapist's office, just describing how we dragged them across the globe and damaged their childhood. Second reason that I was hesitant was about losing control. It was control over my income, my career, my safety net. And all of this fear and anxiety came to a head when I actually had to turn in my resignation to the hospital where I worked. And by this time, we had downsized quite a bit. We had sold our house. We reduced all our possessions down to a few bags. But there was another part of me that was anxious, is that I had to turn in my resignation letter to my department chair. And he was a world-renowned oncologist, and he was also my mentor throughout all residency. And he mentored me, took care of me, and eventually he got me this job at this prestigious medical practice. And I was afraid when I tell him this, what he might say to me. I thought he was going to say, what are you, an idiot? You're giving up all of this and doing what? But the day finally came, and I was standing outside of his office, and I was literally shaking. I was trembling. I was thinking, what am I doing? What am I doing? And as all these thoughts and emotions were swirling in my mind, the door opened, and I had to go in. So I went in, and I had to give him my letter, and I was kind of bracing myself, and I told him what I was going to do. And he kind of read the letter, looked up at me, and something completely and utterly unexpected happened. I saw tears in his eyes. And he started crying in front of me after he read my letter. And you know what he said to me? He said, Bob, I'm so proud of you. I always wanted to do something like this, but I never had the courage. You know what? He is not a Christian, but he supported us financially in our ministry throughout all of our time in Kyrgyzstan. And in that defining moment, what God was telling me is, it's going to be all right. And you don't have to have everything figured out. He was just simply asking me to trust him. And we did. And now 25 years of hindsight, Our kids are mildly damaged. Yes, they are. And yes, they are in therapy. But you know, every one of them says it was worth it. And they would do it again. Because they saw true poverty. They saw faith in action. And they experienced and witnessed aspects of God's character that they would have never known otherwise. And for Grace and me, we did learn a few things too, especially about mission. One of these days when I'm old and gray, I know I'm old and gray now, but when I'm older and grayer, I'm hoping to write a book about mission with all of our experiences, but I already know what the first 4 chapters are going to be. Okay, you ready for this? Chapter 1 is going to be that mission is ultimately about knowing the heart of God. Let me repeat that. Mission is ultimately knowing and doing the heart of God. Number 2, mission is mostly about our formation. It's not what we bring to the table, but how God changes us in the process. 3, mission is holistic. You know, I think the Western church, and I believe the Korean church as well, they tend to dichotomize gospel in word and gospel in deed. But in my mind, practice and proclamation of the gospel go hand in hand. You can't separate the two. So sharing John 3:16 or a Bible verse with somebody, yes, that could be the gospel. But if you sit with somebody who's hurting or healing the sick, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, that is also the gospel. They go hand in hand. Lastly, mission is happening everywhere. It's from everywhere to everywhere. Not just through full-time missionaries in distant lands or through pastors, but everyday people just like you and me, doing simple, ordinary things in quiet and faithful ways, whether in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, or Seoul. So today, I just want to focus on just the first 2, that mission begins with God's heart, and that God uses mission to shape ours. So, and I want to do this by going through one of the most well-known miracles in the Bible. Sorry, I got to take another sip. It's the feeding of the 5,000. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Now, a little bit of Bible trivia. The feeding of the 5,000, did you know that apart from the resurrection, which is the other miracle, there are only 2 miracles that are described in all 4 books of the gospel. Okay, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the resurrection and the feeding of the 5,000. Why? I believe it's because this story gives us a glimpse into God's heart, how he works, how he sees, and how he invites us into mission. So, you ready? Let's fasten your seatbelts. Let me pull up my sleeves. Let's jump in. So John 6, verses 1 through 7. So sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." The great need. Now I want to invite you, picture in your mind's eye the scene. It's a clear day at the Sea of Galilee. You know, there are these rolling hills that are fading into the sea. There might be some distant clouds because there's going to be a windstorm that night, if you read on. And on the hillsides, there are thousands of people. They're sitting in clusters, they're murmuring, they're straining to see the man they came to hear. Now, John tells us there are 5,000 men, just men present. So with women and children, I don't know, maybe 15,000 people, 20,000 people. That's like a full KBO stadium, right? And it's lunchtime. People are getting hungry. Okay, but they're out in the countryside. There's nothing there. There's no GS25. There's no food trucks. There's no restaurants. There's nothing. It's in this moment of growing awareness that they're in the mountain middle of nowhere, Jesus turns to Philip and he goes, "Philip, so where should we buy bread for all these people to eat?" And he said he's asking Philip, knowing full well that what he's about to do next. Now in Matthew's version of the same story, Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." What a crazy command, right? It's a great crowd. It's an overwhelming situation. The need far outweighs the resources. The demand completely outweighs the supply. But you know what? If you think about it, doesn't that what it feels like in our world sometimes? We open our phones and scroll through the headlines. There's war in Gaza and Ukraine. There's famine in Sudan. There's political polarization, climate disasters, refugee crisis, persecution, poverty, resistance to the gospel. The needs are great. The needs are staggering. And in the face of it all, we often feel paralyzed, don't we? Just like Philip was, I'm sure. What can one person possibly do? So typically we do what is safe, right? We tune it out. We bury our heads. We soothe ourselves into distraction. We go numb, thinking that maybe ignorance is bliss. But you know, if you think about it even deeper than that, the great need isn't just out there, right? It's also in here. It's in our own lives too. We feel it in the pressure to perform at school or at work, in struggling marriages, in broken relationships, difficult parenting, health concerns, financial strain, addictions, or just a daily weight of trying to keep it all together. When we see these great needs, whether global or personal, I think our default response is often the same. It's withdrawal or distraction. Or sometimes what I do is I try to kind of grit my teeth and power through it with our own strength. But in our passage, Jesus asked Philip, "Where shall we buy bread?" Now notice the question is not how. He doesn't ask, how shall we buy bread? He says, but where? And John tells us that it was a test because Jesus already knew what he was going to do. Now, Jesus posing this question to Philip, I think, reveals something about Philip's heart. Philip still doesn't fully grasp who Jesus is. Actually, one chapter earlier in John chapter 5, Jesus makes a bold claim about his identity. He says he only does what the Father shows him. He tells the Pharisees that the scriptures they study point directly to him, but they refuse to come to him to find life. And to be honest, that's often my struggle too. When a problem arises, my instinct, and being a high control person, my instinct is to take it into my own hands. If I was actually in Philip's shoes, I would probably just send everybody home. Like, why do we need to feed them? Or I would try collect whatever food there was, only to realize very quickly it's not nearly enough. So Jesus tests Philip. Will he rely on his own resources? Or will he look to the one who can truly fulfill this need? Over the years, through missionary work and now with the State Department, I've been to places where the needs are impossible to ignore. I've seen children digging through garbage heaps in Manila looking for a meal. I've seen sex workers lining the streets of Mumbai. I've seen Christians worshiping in fear in Islamabad. I've seen pastors in Tokyo faithfully serving congregations of only just a handful of people for decades. The need is overwhelming. But sometimes the greatest need that I see is in myself. When I favor YouTube over being in God's word, when I seek comfort more than compassion, when I choose self-preservation over self-sacrificial love, I feel helpless. Do I double down and try harder? Or do I come to Jesus like Peter does later in this chapter? He says, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." Yes, the need is indeed great in the world, in those around us, and in us. But God is greater. The question isn't how are we going to solve this? The question is, to whom shall we go? You know, that's the heart of the gospel, isn't it? God saw the great need, and he didn't look away. He didn't say, humans, figure it out yourselves. He actually came down. He took the burden upon himself and met the need that we as people never could. As Paul writes in Ephesians 2, he says, "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is a gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." We don't begin with our resources. We begin with His. We don't start with our strength. We start with His sufficiency. The need is great, but yes, Savior is greater. And the mission begins by coming to Him first. Let's read on. John chapter 6, verses 8 through 11. Another of His disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place. And they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. Give what you have. Give what you have. Now, to me, it's hard to believe that among 20,000 people, this unnamed boy was the only one who packed a lunch. Surely, there must have been dozens, if not hundreds of people who brought food. So why is this boy singled out? And I wonder what went through his mind when the disciples came looking for food. I don't think he kind of jumped to his feet and ran over, but probably sat for a while hesitating. He thought, should I? I mean, what I got is very little. Or maybe he glanced around and compared with the others, like, that family brought a couple of baskets. That family brought KFC. I just wanted to eat my lunch in peace. Why me? Why are you picking on me? But you know what? Isn't that what we often do when God nudges us towards a need? When the call calls out to serve or give, we hesitate. We look at ourselves and, we feel inadequate. We look at others and think, well, they're more gifted, more spiritual, more available. I'm not great with kids. Someone else should serve in Jubilee's kids ministry. I don't think I have what it takes to serve as a deacon. There are others more qualified, more eloquent, more generous. You fill in the blank. But what this boy does, and I believe what this makes this moment very holy, is that he gives what he has. He doesn't hesitate. It's not much. 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. It's nowhere near enough to meet the great need, but he gives it to Jesus. You know, in Gospel of Mark, in that account, Jesus asks, how many loaves do you have? Okay, how many loaves do you have? He doesn't ask what you wish you had. He asks, what do you have? What do you got? What has already been placed in your hands? You know, it's interesting. This is a question that God asks over and over in the Bible. In Exodus in chapter 4, I don't know if you remember this, a very insecure Moses who is afraid objects to God's call to lead Israel out of bondage. Do you remember this? He says, what if they don't believe me? What am I going to do? And what is God's response? What is that in your hand? What is that in your hand? It's a staff, which God uses to part the sea, to bring forth water from a rock and lead a nation. In Judges, do you remember Gideon's story? The Lord says to a very frightened and afraid Gideon, who's very reluctant to lead the army, says, go in the strength you have. Am I not sending you? Okay. Gideon is then able to lead an army of only 300 men and conquer the Midianite army. Go in the strength you already had, which wasn't much. In 2 Kings chapter 4, there's another story. I don't know if you remember this one. A poor widow pleads with Elisha and asks, what do you have in your house? Do you remember this story? She only has a little bit of olive oil. But God amazingly multiplies the oil to allow her to redeem her sons. In our story today, God asks, how many loaves do you have? You see, God often begins with what we already have. And he asks us to bring our small offering so that he can do something immeasurably more than we can imagine. Let me tell you a story from a more recent era. You probably don't know this gentleman. His name is Oscar Carlson. Now, if there was a Hall of Fame for missionaries and they measured you for ministry impact, this guy would be in the Hall of Fame, but nobody knows him. Oscar was an instructor at a technical trade school in Sweden. He's not a pastor or a theologian. In the late 1960s, when churches in Sweden were calling for missionaries to India, Oscar felt called, he volunteered. He had no formal ministry training, but off he went. And when they arrived in Maharashtra, India, the pastors and the medical people, the nurses, went about starting their work of church planting, building hospitals and things. Oscar, he had no theological credentials. He kind of looked around for things to do. He just kind of helped where he could, fixing things, doing some maintenance. But as the months went by, he began to notice something. The communities in rural India suffer from a lack of clean water, and that's partly because the pumps, the cast iron pumps that they used, couldn't pump water from deep enough. So often water was contaminated and people would get sick. So Oscar thought about this and, using his technical skills, he started tinkering and he drew up a plan for a better pump. And he called it Mark I, okay? And he improved upon the plan and he made additional designs. And then came the Mark II. And eventually he founded a well company that dug wells and used this Mark II. Now, if the story just ended here, good thing that Oscar did. It was very nice, he made a better pump. But you know what happened? UNICEF got a hold of one of these pumps. They saw how good it was, and they adopted the pump across their platforms. Today, I think it's like Mark IV or V. There are 4 million pumps in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, serving communities. 4 million. From a technical school instructor. He didn't set out to build a legacy. Oscar didn't. He simply gave what he had, and God multiplied it to 4 million. Tell you another story. In Japan, gospel came into Japan more than 400 years ago through Catholic missionaries. Yet only about 0.5% to 1% of the population in Japan. Oh, this is a picture of my son, David, when he was in high school, and that's the Mark II. Pumping away. I know he's dressed like an Indian boy, but that's my son. He was in high school. We can go to the next slide. So in Japan, 0.5% to 1% of the population profess faith. And many churches only have like 10 or 20 members. Like church the size of Jubilee would be like a mega church, a big mega church in Japan. And I saw one church, 6 members. Okay, the pastor's family were 4 members, and there were 2 other members. But it's not just for like a few months or a year. For 20 years, that's how they serve. And when I visit Japan, sometimes I ask the believers how they persevere in such difficult soil. How do you hang in there when it's so discouraging? And their answer is amazing. They say, Dr. Bob, Japanese people are very faithful. We give what we can and we stay faithful. What they have, what they give is faithfulness. They give their faithfulness. One of the most impactful missionaries that I met in Kyrgyzstan during our time there was a retired hairdresser from Korea. Single lady, in her 60s. She came and taught local women how to cut hair. She shared her life and she loved these women really well. She also did not bring a seminary degree. She just brought scissors, her kindness, and the gospel. One of the most impactful missionaries I've ever met. To give what we have means letting go of the lie that we must become someone else or better resource before God could use us. But we don't need to be more gifted, more wealthy, more charismatic, more anything. We offer what God has already placed in our hands, right? Our time, our words, our presence, maybe even our story. And let God bless it, break it, and multiply it. Now, that doesn't always mean inventing the Mark II or moving across the world or laboring for 30 years in a very difficult place. Sometimes as simple as going on a mission trip to Sri Lanka. Saying yes to serving on Jubilee's children's ministry or worship ministry or translation ministry. It might be sitting with somebody in our community who's grieving or struggling. Volunteering with the homeless ministry for a day. And maybe even choosing faithfulness today, even if it feels really small. And it's not out of fear or guilt. It's out of invitation. What might God do through your 5 loaves and 2 fish. You know, at the end of our lives, the 6 words that we so long to hear is not going to be, well done, good and successful servant. It's going to be, well done, good and faithful servant. And this too is the heart of the gospel. God saw the great need. God gave what he had. It just turned out to be his son. It's the only solution to the problem of sin. To quote John 3:16, 18, tells us, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, what he had, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. God gave what he had to meet the world's deepest need. So my question to you is this: what is that in your hand? What are you holding right now? All right, last section. When they had all enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is a prophet who has come into the world. Gather the leftovers, gather the leftovers. You know, what's interesting is, you know, even though this account is in all 4 Gospels, the Gospel of John is the only account that includes this command by Jesus. Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. And the detail, I think, is really easy to miss, but I believe John intentionally includes this. Why? Because there's something just deeply profound here about how God works. There's something deeply profound. It's not just in the moment of the miracle, but in what remains afterwards, the leftovers. Now, what are leftovers? In our house, we have a cabinet full of like plastic containers, cling wrap, food bags, tools for storing the food that we couldn't finish. And we usually save the food with the intention of using them. But if we're honest, more often than not, we put it in the back of the fridge, they get forgotten, and they grow moldy, and we throw them away. But I feel like we do the same with some parts of our lives, don't we? The leftovers of our lives are parts we wish we could forget. Past mistakes, painful experiences, lingering wounds, failures, regrets, or even seasons of shame and doubt. They feel like scraps. They feel like broken pieces we rather toss and revisit. But what's amazing here, Jesus says, let nothing be wasted. Let nothing be wasted. You see, the 12 baskets of leftovers weren't just about food going to waste. There were signs. There were visible evidence of a miracle. Perhaps some people in the crowd missed the moment of the multiplication, but no one could deny that there were 12 baskets full left over that came from 2 fish and 5 loaves. You see, in God's hands, even what seems insignificant becomes a testimony. And I believe this is the beautiful paradox of God's economy, how the kingdom works. He uses what the world discards. He glorifies what feels wasted. Right? You hear the last coming first. The weak are made strong. The foolish shame the wise. Power is perfected in weakness and brokenness of all things. Life comes through death. And what this means is that your wounds, your shame, the broken chapters of your life, no, they're not wasted. God redeems them. And in his mercy, they're actually the very things that he uses to bless others. It's not your strengths, it's not your success, it's your weaknesses, particularly for those who are hurting and in need. There's an author that we love, his name is Jim Branch. He puts it this way: once we are willing and courageous enough to give Jesus our little loaves and fish, he does something really amazing with it. He takes it, then he blesses it, then he breaks it, and then he gives it. It is in the breaking that the multiplying occurs. At the times when we are the most broken are usually the times when we feel we have the least to give, but the opposite is true. Somehow in the brokenness, it stops being about us and our ability to multiply ourselves. and it becomes about God and his ability to multiply what we bring with his strong and tender hands. Let me introduce you to somebody. This is Sunita, a woman that I met in Pune, India. And just by the way, I have her permission to share her photo, her name, and her story. Sunita was born in rural India, and at age 14, her family, who was in deep debt, married her off to a 40-year-old man. And later, at age 16, her husband sold her off to a brothel to pay off his own debts. And for the next 20 years, Sunita endured a life of prostitution. Now, eventually, a Christian organization called the Hindustani Covenant Church actually intervened, and they bought her freedom. It's like indentured servanthood, right? You know, the amazing thing is, you know how much it costs to buy her freedom? 200 US. That's what life costs in some parts of the world. Now, after she was free, she could have chosen bitterness. She could have stayed hidden, but instead she chose redemption. Sunita moved into a safe house called the Home of Hope, where women rescued from trafficking learn trade, they rebuild their lives, and they find healing. But over time with Sunita, she just didn't survive, she thrived. You see, Sunita eventually became the director of the Home of Hope, rescuing and mentoring other women from the same streets that once she used to walk. Her pain didn't disqualify her, it empowered her. Her story carried weight with the other women because she had lived her story. She had been there. One of the enterprises that are run by these women is making communion wafers for churches throughout the world, if you can pull up. So they make, the flat communion wafers. And I bought a couple of packages, and we're going to reuse them for our communion next Sunday. Okay, so please remember this story when we use these communions. And it's cool. The women have an informal motto. They say, once we used to sell our bodies, now we make the body of Christ. Isn't that pretty cool? The hands that once suffered, now prepare the body of Christ. Sunita's life is a picture of this truth, that nothing is wasted in God's kingdom. Nothing is wasted. I've seen it in others, but I've already also seen it in myself. Now, as I said, I served as a missionary for nearly 20 years. But there was a season when I felt like a missionary leftover. When we first landed in Central Asia, I had a 7-page list of goals that I wanted to do. I dreamt of transforming lives, healing the sick, running clinics, discipling leaders. So when we arrived in Kyrgyzstan, I hit the ground running. We were launching development projects. I was treating patients, teaching, doing all manner of ministry, and we showed you some of those pictures early. But after 2 years of this, the reality was crushing because I hit a brick wall. By 2 years, not a single person had come to faith. No lives were visibly changed. Culture, predominantly a Muslim culture, was resistant. Language acquisition was very frustrating. And then to cap it all off, the Kyrgyz government actually stripped me of my ability to practice medicine. They said I needed to get a local license. And they stopped the only thing that I felt like I was still good at. And it was truly a desert season. I remember one bitterly cold January day. It's super cold in Kyrgyzstan. And Grace and I, we were sitting in front of an old school radiator wrapped in a blanket. And to be honest, I think we were depressed. We're discouraged. We felt like failures. I feel like I was letting everybody down as missionaries. And again, I was asking myself, what am I doing? What am I doing here? And to be honest, I think if we could have just left everything, picked everything up, gone back home with the tail between our legs. But there are two things that held us there, allowed us to persevere. One, we knew that people were praying for us. That all throughout the world, people were praying. And that thought alone gave us enough courage to persevere. The second thought was shame. I didn't want to go back as a missionary failure and to tell all our supporters, we failed, and now we're back home. Now, during this time, it's a season of brokenness, but this was just before the Kyrgyz government took away my license. I was still running clinics, and I was going to villages on a regular basis to see patients. And it was one of those clinics in a village called Jambalak. It means spiritual spring, nice name. I met this woman named Jungle, and that's her photo that's projected. Now, there are many unforgettable things about Jungle. One is that she was in her 60s when I met her. She had 14 children. She had essentially been pregnant all of her life, starting from the time she was 16, 14 kids. The other thing that was unforgettable about Jungle is that she was a village shaman. In Korean, it's Mudang, right? Now, while Kyrgyz are predominantly Muslim, in many rural communities, they still practice kind of ancient folk religions, and she was one of them. And shamans are both feared and shunned in villages. And Jungle was one of them. And because of that, she lived in the fringes. She was kind of a leftover, if you will, in her society. But perhaps the most memorable thing about Jungle to me is her name, Jungle. Now, Kyrgyz culture, like most Central Asian countries, it's highly patriarchal. So sons are much prized over daughters. And one of the ways this value system gets expressed in their culture is the names parents give to their children, especially when they have a daughter and they wanted a boy. Now, one of these names is Burulsun. Now, Burul literally means to turn, Burul. Burulsun means, may my fortunes turn. We had a daughter, may my fortunes turn next time. And we have a baby girl, or baby boy. Another interesting name is Ul Kelsin. Ul Kelsin means the sun will come. Now, how'd you like to be a little girl growing up in Central Asia and your name is the sun will come? But by far, the worst name they give to girls is her name, Jungle. Do you know what it means? Literally means mistake. Mistake. As in the God somehow made a mistake. You were supposed to be a boy. Now, Jungle came to the clinic with a small tumor on her scalp. And over the years, it had grown rapidly. She didn't have any money to go to the hospital. So she tried some folk remedies. It wasn't working, but for several years, this was left unchecked, and it continued to grow. And one day she heard this American doctor was in her village, so she thought she'd give me a try, and she showed up. And I met her. She took off her scarf, and immediately I knew what it was, and I knew it was too late. Because it was a form of skin cancer that was neglected. And eventually it had spread all throughout her scalp, and it was invading her neck. You can kind of see the bandage, and she was having trouble breathing. It was beyond anything that medicine could fix. Still, I didn't want to abandon her, so I did promise her that we would just try to do what we can. And over the next several months, a local Kyrgyz pastor and I visited her weekly to change her dressings and do what we could. Now, her family, a folky Kyrgyz medicine is applying when you have a big wound, and it was a weepy, very vascular, bloody tumor. They apply raw bread dough. So each week we were scraping away the rotten bread dough mixed with pus and blood. It wasn't particularly glamorous or particularly effective. But you know what? It was what we had. And this is how we could love her. And I think that's what mattered. Jungle eventually passed away a few months later. But the amazing thing that happened is about 3 weeks before she passed, this pastor friend of mine shared the gospel with her in her own language, from her own people, and Jungle believed. She heard, she understood, and she received the truth that Jesus loved her and died for her. And for me, after nearly 2 years of what felt like fruitless labor, she became the first person to come to faith. And then she eventually passed away. And I can say without hesitation that if I hadn't been so broken at the time, if things had gone according to my plans, I might be tempted to take credit. I would have thought, see, this is the fruit of my ministry and my planning. But I knew better. I couldn't treat her. I hadn't even shared the gospel. I could barely communicate in her language. And yet God had been working all along. God had been stirring her heart. God had brought her to that moment. And I was simply there. I was wounded. I was tired. I was discouraged. But I was willing to give what I had. Here's what's even more incredible. Remember that I mentioned she had 14 children? Well, after her Django passed away, 8 of them started coming to church, just seeing the love that the local believers offered their mom. And that's not what's even more incredible. One of the 8, the oldest son, he is a mullah at the local mosque. He's a teacher at the local mosque. And you know what he said to us? He says, we've never seen love like this, not even from the Muslims. Django, a woman named Mistake, a shaman, an outcast, a leftover in her society, became the one who sparked a small movement of faith in her village. And for us, for me and Grace, it restored our hope, and it reminded us why we had come to Kyrgyzstan in the first place. And that too is the gospel, right? God lets nothing be wasted. He redeems our shame, our sin, our failure for his glory and his kingdom. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. So here's my question to you. What are the broken leftover pieces in your life? Please note that God doesn't throw them away. He gathers them. He redeems them. And through them, he tells a greater story than we could ever write by ourselves. Here's a sermon title, Reveal. It all starts with G, so it's easy to remember. Great need, give what you have, gather the leftovers. Friends, the story of feeding of the 5,000 isn't just about a miracle that happened long ago. It's about how God still works today in our world, in our church, and in us. We've seen the great need, overwhelming, global, personal. The question Jesus asks us is not, how will you solve this, but to whom will you go? Give what we have, give what we have. Not what we wish we had, not what we think would be more impressive, but what we already have in our hands. He blesses it, he breaks it, and he multiplies it. And lastly, gather what is left, the broken leftover pieces we'd rather hide. He gathers, redeems, and uses it to tell a greater story. So what about you? What do you see as a great need in the world, or maybe even in your own life? What do you already have that Jesus is asking you to bring to him? What are the leftovers in your story? Perhaps pain, shame, failure that God is waiting to redeem. And I want to extend this to us as a church community as well, to Jubilee. What are the needs that we see around us here in Seoul? What resources had God given us that he's asking us to offer back to him? And what are the broken leftover things in our shared story that God is longing to redeem? Don't get me wrong, I'm not here to guilt trip you, and I'm not here to have you sign up for 100 ministries. But I do believe that God is stirring our hearts today to see the need, to respond in faith, and to trust him with your story. Maybe it's a call to serve, even in a small way. Maybe it's a prompting to go on a mission trip to Sri Lanka, or simply across the room to someone who is in need. Maybe it's an invitation to finally bring your pain, your shame, your past to Jesus and say, Lord, take it. Let nothing be wasted. There is no one too small, too broken, too late, too leftover for God. And if you ever wonder whether your small offering, your quiet faithfulness, your hidden wounds matter, just look at the baskets. 12 baskets of leftovers. Witness to the power and compassion of a God who uses every part of the story for his glory. Now, as we close, I want to take a moment. Feel free to close your eyes or keep them open. And just give you just a moment here to think about this. Why don't you ask God, what are you asking me to see? What are you asking me to give? And finally, what are you asking me to surrender? And whatever your answer may be, I invite you to bring it to Jesus. Because he is still the one who takes what we have, he breaks it, blesses it, and gives it. He gives it until the world is fed, until the broken are healed, and until the kingdom comes. Father, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for this glimpse into how you operate, how you've already given us all that we need, and that we need to simply give it back to you so that you may use it to bless it to others. So would you just impress this truth into our hearts and help us to, Lord, look for ways, explore the places where we can give this back to you so that you can redeem it. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.
This time we're moving into the time of offering. Ushers can come to the front. Will creation suddenly articulate with 1,000 tongues to lift one cry? Then from north to south and east to west, we hear Christ be magnified. We hear cries
an appropriate song to sing in light of the message. Indeed, Lord, thank you for this time of offering, this time of response, that we can remember that the life you've given us is a life that is to be given, that you made us to be givers and not takers, that it is indeed more blessed to give than to take, that we are made to serve and not be served. Lord Jesus, this world and our sinful nature gets it all wrong. We get it so backwards. We just become a black hole of ourselves, imploding upon ourselves when we live for ourselves. Lord Jesus, I pray, Father, that when we look to you, we will see what true life is about. That it really is about the giving of ourselves, to be broken by your loving hands, that we may be multiplied to feed the masses, Lord, for your glory's sake. Lord Jesus, we have one life. What are we living for? We have one life to represent something. What are we trying to represent, Lord? What is there more worthy than to represent your life, your love, your truth that sets free, Lord Jesus? I pray, Father, that you break in and take hold of our hearts, our minds in a fresh way today, Lord Jesus, again or anew. That all that we are and all that we have may be the means to this very end. That who you are will be glorified in and through us, through the altar of our lives. We lift this offering unto you, Lord Jesus. We don't need talents to be faithful. We don't need resources to be true. Just a heart to care, to love you, and to love one another. Help us, Lord. Bless us this way. And in this heart, Lord, we want to go ahead and commission our Sri Lanka team. Sri Lanka team, can you come on up to the stage? In this time of offering, we want to bless this team now. Woo! Yeah! You want to stretch all the way out? We'll make a giant. All right. You can stop there. So as a time of offering, oh, this works. In this time of offering appropriately, we are going to commission this team. Can I ask our leadership to come forward at this time and surround them from the back? We're going to lay hands on them. So leadership, deacons, elders, if you're here, please come on down. Come up to the stage and you can stand behind them. Let's lay hands on each of them. And the rest of us, from where we are standing, if you do not mind, let's reach out our hands as a sign of God's nearness, God's favor, God's anointing, to bless this offering to multiplication for His glory in Sri Lanka. Hallelujah. Church, let's pray together. Let's commission this team. Praise the Lord. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Lord Jesus, we thank you. We thank you so much for this momentous occasion that after all these years, due to COVID, we can finally have this moment of commissioning a team for international missions. We're so grateful that your living presence is here and we can see signs of this in this team. And we thank you, Lord, that as a church, even though they may be going, we can join together as one family, sending them out in prayer, in resources. I pray you receive all this glory, Lord. And we just bless them, Lord, that everything that was just shared today by Elder Bob will be made true and experienced true in each of their lives and through their lives, Lord Jesus. Lord, some of them are actually theologians, but most of them are not. They're just outside of Pastor Joe and Pastor Stephen. Everyone's just doing their thing. But Lord, they're giving up their Chuseok vacation. They definitely put in cash. They're gonna go dance and do things that they never did before. But Lord, we know that you are good, and we know that you can do immeasurably more than what we can ever imagine when we just offer up what we have. They saw the need. They're gonna give what they got, And certainly leftovers, the leftovers are going to be used as well. So Lord, won't you do this great work of multiplication? Thank you for this opportunity to connect with the Ceylonese Evangelistic Association. The Mahesh is there, our brothers and sisters there that are going to work alongside together to be a blessing, I pray. So thank you so much for this moment of commission as they leave this Wednesday. Bless them with all sorts of blessings of safety, of provision, of team unity, and of course, kingdom impact, Lord Jesus. We thank you for all this. And in Jesus' name we pray all this. Hallelujah and amen. Hallelujah. Praise be to God. All right. Feel free to take your seats at this time. And as we remain standing, let's wrap up our service time by praising the Lord all the more with doxology. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise Him, all creatures here below. Praise Him above, ye heavenly hosts. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Church, won't you join with me in praying the Lord's Prayer? Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come and thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. And now may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of the Father, and the communion of the Holy Spirit rest upon all those here. That our lives were designed to be broken in your loving hands, to be multiplied. I pray, Father, that this revelation and this anointing and this commitment to rest upon all those here, both now and forevermore. Amen. All right, Jubilee, God bless, God keep. Newcomers orientation, come on down to the front. We have that orientation meeting to start here. And remember, it's Fellowship Sunday, so enjoy the meal, everyone. Enjoy especially the fellowship. Praise God.
Okay, guys, with me. You are holy. You are mighty. You are mighty. You are worthy. You are worthy. Worthy of praise. Worthy of praise. I will find